So tonight we're talking about randomness in gaming. And randomness has really existed in pretty much every game in one form or another, even probably in chess. From an example of, yes, there are kind of set out plays and moves that you will do, but you adjust your tactics based upon what your opponent does. So it's almost random in what is your opponent going to do. So even the games that you don't think are random have some even minor elements of randomness. Most people think there's kind of good randomness and bad randomness. Bad randomness meaning like it's quite infuriating because you not only don't know that that random element is going to happen, there's nothing you can really do about it either. It's like if a game is completely random, you might as well just flip a coin because at the end of the game, it's pure luck of the draw who wins. It won't be through your skill. It won't be through your strategy. If there's too much randomness, that's kind of bad randomness. When it comes to good randomness, it has some degree of kind of player interaction, and it basically gives you the ability to manipulate the randomness or at least meaningfully respond to the outcome of that randomness, if you like. Now, a lot of what I'm going to talk about tonight, I'm going to be referencing people like Jeff Engelstein. Anybody that's into board games will know who Jeff Engelstein is. And also a guy called Adam Millard who did a topic not too dissimilar from this. And I just found the stuff he was talking about was really interesting. So I'll put links in the description down to those. Now, there are really probably four kinds of randomness. There's what's called input randomness, and this happens even before you start playing. This is something that it randomizes the game from the start before you've even rolled a dice, if you like. There's output randomness, and this is what happens because you did something in the game. So I want to shoot you, I'm now going to roll a dice. That is output randomness. There is an output of randomness from your decision. You also get reactive randomness, and that is something that basically happens in the game and you can react to that. And then there's also controllable randomness, and this is something that you can do to minimize randomness or maybe to mitigate the effect of that. And I am going to say randomness a lot tonight, so I apologize in advance. So we start talking about random input. Now this is kind of randomized. This is like randomizing the game before players even began. Think of something like Warcry, where you draw a deployment card, you draw a scenario card, you draw the terrain layout, if you like, a terrain layout card, and you also draw a twist card. This is input randomness, and it creates some really strange and weird combinations, if you like. And the easiest way to control this kind of randomness in a game is by randomizing within limits. So setting some kind of limits that allows, it's still random, but it's almost within boundaries, if you like. So think about Star Wars Legion. If anybody's familiar with Star Wars Legion, the way you set up your games in Star Wars Legion is this kind of like a pick and a ban list. If anybody's familiar with like kind of with competitive League of Legends, similar kind of thing where you basically, I think there's three of each different card. I forget exactly what they are, but there's deployment, there's a scenario, and something else. And taking turns, you get to kind of pick one, ban one, and that is a way of controlling that random input. Or you could also limit it to the number of scenarios you can choose before the game sets up. So if there's only 6 scenarios and you roll a d6 to choose which one, that randomness is limited, or it's kind of within limits because there are only 6 to choose from. For example, because Warcry has those decks of cards, I'm sure I read somewhere there's about 14 million different combinations of selecting because you're choosing 4 cards, and I think there's something like 36 cards in a deck. The number of options you can get from that is like 14 million. Now that is a lot of randomness. So one way to kind of control that would be to drop down the number of cards in a deck. If you only start playing with the ones that are sort of marked with the match play symbol, that sort of puts boundaries around the amount of randomness that's in that. Now, input randomness is actually very good as well for competitive gaming because this allows people to kind of test player skill and strategy as they need to learn to adapt to the game that is laid out in front of them. If you went to a tournament and every time you went, you always knew the terrain was going to be in the same place, you always knew the board deployments were going to be the same, you always knew what you were going to face, that lack of randomness would mean that you would tailor your list to just work one way. And And there is randomness at tournaments. When you turn up, you don't know who you're going to play. You don't know what army they're going to play. You don't know what list you're going to play. So you need to basically tailor a list to almost to take on all comers, if you like. If you swing it too far one way, you can be caught out, really. So that is input randomness, even in what would be classed as competitive gaming. And this is where controllable input randomness comes in. So games that like Magic do this really, really well. You can choose to build your deck before the game starts. So yes, you're going to have, I think it's 64 cards, I think it is, something like that, in a Magic deck. When you draw cards from your deck, you don't know what cards you're going to get, but you have picked the cards that went into that deck originally, so you know at some point the cards you put in there will come out at some point. It's controlled randomness. Super Fantasy Brawl, which is fingers crossed will deliver soon from Mythic, is another good example of this from miniature gaming. There are no dice. There is fixed damage output from the different models. Each kind of champion, if you like, or each hero has 6 cards that they then put into a deck. And yes, it's random which cards you come out with each kind of hand. So you don't know what you're going to be able to do that next turn. However, it is controlled because you only have a deck of 18 cards. You will cycle through them pretty quickly. Now, Warhammer Underworlds falls also into this category. The game can still be played. The game can still be very random. We are rolling dice after all, but the randomness can somewhat be kind of controlled by building the deck that you will work with to create a strategy. If you want to be very objective heavy, if you like, if you want to claim objectives, there's a way you can kind of build a deck and try and control it that way. So yes, it's random what cards you're going to get, what you're going to be able to do each turn, but it's controlled randomness. Now, a game I'm going to be reviewing later on this week is Escape the Dark Sector, which is the follow-up to Escape the Dark Castle from Themebone Games. And you basically set up that game, or both of those games to be fair, you set them up by building a random encounter deck. And it's controlled by basically having 3 cards from each act. There's Act 1, 2 and 3. You have a starting card and you have a boss card. And for all, it's a random encounter. It's a random encounter in a set deck, if you like. So, for example, if basically every card in that box, you basically just shuffled them together and picked out, let's say, 15 cards, there's a chance that you could sort of face 4 bosses straight one after the other before you even had a chance to pick up any kind of weapons that you need to equip yourself with. Now, that would be completely random and would actually be very detrimental against you. But the game, for all it's random in its nature, it's controlled randomness. Now, a game I reviewed a little while ago called Highlander by Riverhorse Games suffered from this issue because it was possible to draw the card that basically beheaded your character before you'd done anything else in the game. You hadn't had a chance to go through the different decks and to be able to sort of get yourself some mitigating factors. There was a chance that you could literally flip over the top card and you were dead. And it was one of the things that I referenced when I reviewed that. Now, of the two sides of input and output randomness, input is the less dynamic of the two. It's essentially just, it sets up the game and then it leaves players to get on with it. Basically, however that game falls out, Warcry being a perfect example, you just got to kind of deal with it. It does create variety, but it doesn't interfere with skill testing. This is perfect for more skill-based and competitive games. In comparison, output randomness is about constant change throughout the game. Here, basically, the randomness comes after you make a decision. You surrender a lot of control to the dice gods, or to the flip of a coin, or to the flip of a card. And this can be infuriating. Have you ever basically been in one of those situations where you've lost a game, where you've done everything right, but basically you've rolled the dice at the end, you've got all ones, and you've lost the game on that dice roll? This is when too much randomness basically, like I said before, it can feel like a coin flip. You might as well just flip the coin at the start of the game to get it over and done with. However, a few small changes to output randomness can be a great way to test skills of basically be able to improvise on the fly, and also of risk management. sort of this is what brings in those memorable moments that we love to see, and these are the moments that we love to talk about when it comes to games. Dungeons and Dragons is a perfect example of this, and even if the dice roll doesn't go right for you, it can basically lead to more exciting kind of storytelling. So if you're basically equipped as like a sort of a hardened fighter, and every time you come to fight, you basically you have awful rolls on your dice. However, there's that one point in the game where you basically crit an intelligence check and you get more of the story that you weren't expecting. It completely unfolds the story in a different direction, and that can lead to some really sort of memorable moments. I keep saying memorable moments because those are the bits you remember. Those are the bits that you weren't expecting, and they completely change the game for you and give you an experience probably far outweighing one if it had been pretty scripted, because everything just went by the stats, if you like. It makes for a much more fulfilling role-playing experience. Now, reacting to randomness can create some fantastic twists and turns that you can't see them coming. However, you can be left feeling basically like no amount of skill or any planning has really made any difference. And this is where the controllable output randomness comes in. So games like 40k have a lot of output randomness in their game. There are multiple dice rolls basically for something to happen. You roll to hit, and then you roll to wound, and then your opponent rolls to save, and then they might have a special rule like Disgustingly Resilient, where they can roll again. There's a lot of randomness to get to that point, and you can be left feeling that basically it's a bit of a crapshoot basically. But what you can do is basically, this is where sort of good design comes in, and this is where you can include controllable mitigation things, such as spending command points in 40k. You can spend a command point to re-roll a dice. This is a way to basically to try and overcome those moments where you really need them to happen and the dice just don't go for you. Now, it's also another point where this is where risk management comes in, and knowing when to spend those control points, command points, because you only have so many. It's another way of letting randomness create a different kind of a game, but giving you some control back to do something about it when you really need it to happen. So risk management is just as important as skill, and knowing when to save those finite resources to try and help is also very important. Some games that do this really well, Malifaux does this with its basically cheating fate mechanic and its soul stones. Wild West Exodus does it with its fortune chips, of knowing when to spend them to get an extra action or to add to a particular attack. And Kings of War Vanguard does it as well quite well with its power dice, and basically giving you those extra moments of, I really need to do this heroic thing, this is going to help me out at this particular moment. And the trick is knowing when to push your luck and basically when to kind of hold back. Blood Bowl is another great example of how this works, where basically all your best laid plans can go completely out of the window and fall apart on the roll of a dice. You can fall and scatter. You might not catch the ball. You might not be able to kind of to push it and to go that extra square. However, good players know in which order to complete their actions. They know how to do the plays. So they're mitigating risk. They are sort of balancing the stats of, yes, it's risky to do this dice roll, but if I do everything else first, I'm reducing the randomness of everything that's basically happening. Knowing when to remove the randomness basically relies on a lot of skill in the game. Now, randomness is also a hugely powerful tool that basically games designers and developers, they have that within the game design, but knowing how to constrain it is so important, and it needs to serve the player experience. It shouldn't just be in there because it's an easy way of not balancing a game. It shouldn't be just in there basically just to create some kind of chaos. It needs to add to the player experience. Now, complete randomness does have its place in some games. My son is almost 4 years old, and one of his favourite games for us to play is a game where basically you have a six-sided dice, which instead of numbers has colours on the sides, and you have dinosaurs with 6 coloured spots on their back, and you roll that dice, and if it's red, you pick up a red disc and you put it on your dinosaur, and then you roll it again, and you basically have to try and get all 6 colours. Now, he absolutely loves that game. There is no skill involved. There is nothing I can do to improve my chances of winning. There's nothing he can do to improve his chances of winning. But it's an educational tool for matching colours. And it also means that players of completely different abilities and completely different skills can still play on a level playing field, if you like. So there are some games where complete randomness isn't always a bad thing. But randomness is inherently unfair, really. But when it comes to games, it is really equally unfair on both players. Just because something is unfair or it's uncertain, it doesn't mean that it can't be skill testing or force you to strategize on the fly when things change. Now, through thinking about randomness and through some of the games I've been playing recently, I've learned that I much prefer games where higher elements of controlled output randomness are included. The critical hits that you get in Warcry, for example. So for those not familiar, if you roll a 4 or a 5, you might get 2 points of damage on your opponent, but if you roll a 6, it might be 5 points of damage. That's quite random and it's quite swingy. In God Tier, which I'm really enjoying at the moment, if anybody hasn't seen my review, please do check it out. There are some spiky dice rolls in there, and you can mitigate that to an extent by using your boons or your blights against your opponent to either add dice or take dice away. Whilst it's a very strategic game, putting in those kind of spiky dice rolls stops it becoming too predictable. And again, Kings of War, when you come to roll that nerve check and you know it's the one you need to go off and you get that double 1, that can be very random, but also brings in those moments of like that last ditch effort of being saved. Now, eliminating randomness can usually eliminate fun of a game also. Randomness is to be appreciated as long as it's intentional and it's basically constrained and controlled. Now, randomness is what gives us them swings of kind of impending doom, followed by that like unbridled comeback against all of the odds. And that's what I want from a game, whether I win the game or whether I lose the game. And that's why I think randomness is not to be feared. It's something that should be embraced. And games are better for it if they're designed with that randomness in mind. Thanks for watching my video. I hope that you really enjoyed it. And if you did, why not consider clicking on the suggested video below to see more of the work that I've done. If you'd like to support the long-term sustainability of this channel, why not consider checking out my Patreon, where you can pledge and support from as little as $2 a month, and there is lots of different tiers and bonuses which will give you access to a private Discord server. It will give you free t-shirts, free mugs, a podcast every month, and a number of other things, including getting your name at the end of every video, like these awesome folks who already support me now.